Good afternoon. Welcome to Preservation Connecticut Spring 2024 series, talking about preservation. Our noontime chats about everything preservation. I'm Jane Montanaro, Executive Director of Preservation Connecticut, and I'm pleased to be your host. Today, we are chatting with Donald Rogers, PhD, who will present his research of Connecticut's industrial development during the Progressive Era. Dr. Rogers is Emeritus Adjunct Lecturer of U.S. History at Central Connecticut State University, with a PhD in Legal History from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and author or editor of 3 books, most recently, Workers Against the City, The Fight for Free Speech in Hague versus CIO, and he recently published the essay Trademark Wars, Yale in Town Defends Its Corporate in a 2023 issue of Connecticut Explored. But before I hand the program over to Dr. Rogers, I'd like to share some background about Preservation Connecticut. Preservation Connecticut is the statewide, private nonprofit historic preservation organization founded in 1975 by a special act of the Connecticut General Assembly as the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation, to preserve, protect, and promote the buildings, sites, and landscapes that contribute to the heritage and vitality of Connecticut's communities. We are statutory partners with the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office, and I'm proud to say that for 49 years, we have successfully championed the protection of remarkable community assets all over the state by leveraging funding, advocating, forming partnerships, and promoting stewardship. Our office is located in the Eli Whitney Boarding House on Whitney Avenue in Hamden, listed on the National Register of Historic Places. It's the only surviving residential structure of the industrial village that's Eli Whitney's Armory, and it has served as Preservation Connecticut's headquarters since 1989. We have a staff of 9 preservation professionals and a board of 19 preservationists from around the state. Staff listed here are always available to assist with inquiries. Chris Wiegren is our Deputy Director. Contact Chris for information on historic preservation easements, our bi-monthly magazine, Connecticut Preservation News, our Olmsted in Connecticut Landscape Survey, and to arrange book talks for his book, Connecticut Architecture, Stories of 100 Places. Renee Tribert is our Making Places and Preservation Services Manager. Please contact Renee for information on redevelopment of historic industrial sites and tax credit applications. Jordan Sorensen is our Development and Special Projects Manager. Jordan manages our communications and outreach through social media and email, receives and monitors demolition notices from municipalities, and prepares historic tax credit applications and nominations to State and National Register of Historic Places. Kristen Hopewood is our Membership and Outreach Manager. She manages all the inquiries that come through our website, provides member services, arranges special events, and is the editor of our Historic Properties Exchange, a free listing of threatened historic properties. And finally, our team of circuit riders, Mike Farino, Field Service Director, Brad Scheid, Stacy Vero, and Stefan Danchuk. They provide immediate boots-on-the-ground service to homeowners, developers, municipal leaders, nonprofit organizations and museums, historic district commissioners, and much, much more, with an array of preservation technical assistance, including community organizing, prioritizing maintenance and repairs, historic designations, funding, and archaeology. These lunchtime chats have become an important and enjoyable tool for us to meet our mission. We're able to connect with the public and hear what's on your mind. Please feel free to use the chat function to ask questions at the end of the presentation, or contact us afterwards for a call or a site visit. Looking ahead to next week's program, Wednesday, May 15th at noon with Wesleyan professor Jesse Nasta. Join us to learn about one of the earliest free Black neighborhoods in Connecticut, Beaman Triangle in Middletown. This small activist community had a significant role in Black freedom and resilience in the state before the Civil War. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Rogers. And the screen is yours, Dr. Rogers. There you go.
Thank you very much, Jane. It's a really a pleasure to be with Preservation Connecticut. Thank you so much to those of you in the audience. Um, Today, my presentation comes out of a book in progress on the history of Connecticut during the Progressive Era of American history. And this was a period of enormous urban industrial growth. Um, so often divided into two parts, one part called the Gilded Age, 1870s to 1890s, the second part, 1890s, 1910s, when there was a political pushback against many of the problems of industrial growth. There's some historians now who argue that these periods should go together, but I'm one of those who said they really are separate, particularly because of changes in industry. And that's where I've started my study and what I want to share with you today. I want to talk about a narrow slice of Connecticut history. That is the growth of industry, the business side of things. This, of course, is only a small part of all the changes that took place in the late 19th and early 20th century. But it's my way of thinking that the foundation of change for just about everything comes from change in industry. And so that's why I'm starting there and sharing with you some of my thoughts and some of the implications, I think, of these developments. And let's see if I can see how to advance how do I advance the?
You can put it in slideshow first, the top menu.
Don't see that. So I don't know if everybody can see that. Maybe I can.
Your slides, we just have the whole list on the side. Oh, there you go.
Very good.
Perfect.
Okay. So conventional wisdom leaves us only with a general and vague idea of how Connecticut industry changed over the course of state history. And I'd like just to begin with a short example of this. This is a travel log written by Joel Cook, who was a travel writer for the Philadelphia Public Ledger. He made an early career of doing travels across the country and then leaving travel logs behind. And later on, he went into politics. But during this journalistic part of his career, he did a trip into Connecticut in 1889. And you can see traveled the railroad from New York City down to New Haven, and then along the railroad up north toward the Massachusetts border through Hartford. And later on, he published an account of what he saw along the way. And some of his observations are this, and they might sound familiar to us. Overall, he found Connecticut's terrain to be a rugged surface. And he said that Connecticut had a bleak climate, poor soil, generous distribution of rocks. And it's a stereotype. All that discouraged farming. But he noted that the numerous hills and streams of Connecticut offered water power for mills and factories. He consequently came across areas where, as he put it, settlers overpowered Native Americans or crowded them off the land. It's an illustration of the attitude of the time. And where Connecticut residents produce all kinds of economic activity. Nests of busy mills in places like Norfolk, Milford, and Middletown. Large hives of industry, enormous factories in Bridgeport and New Haven. Residential towns like Stratford. Standing areas along the Quinnipiac River where only brickmaking was profitable. And one fertile area in the state, this was the region north of Hartford along the river where tobacco grew. The account is really good, I think, in capturing the diversity of economic activities in Connecticut during the time, but it leaves us with a lot of stereotypes too. The rocky soil, which stymied agriculture. I'm going to suggest that that's a little bit overdrawn. The disregard that residents had toward the rights of indigenous people, pushing them aside to make way for progress. Water power was a conspicuous component of the state's industrial development. That's true, but I'm going to argue that by the time we get to the progressive era, fossil fuel, coal-powered energy is becoming much more important. And importantly, Connecticut was a manufacturing state, where it talks about the nests and large hives of industrial activity and enormous factories. One question that came up ahead of time was Connecticut a leading industrial state? Or was it the leading industrial state? And the answer is it was never the leading industrial state, but it was up there because New England was the cockpit of American industrialization. So early on, when the early 19th century, when New England was leading industry, Connecticut was in the top 3 or 4. But as we move to the late 19th century and the rest of the country catches up, then Connecticut sort of drops down the list. And to the time we get to the early 20th century, Connecticut's in probably 7th or 8th place and slipping fast pretty quickly. So, but what Joel Cook does not leave us with is a sense of how Connecticut industry changed. What I would like to leave with you is a sort of a nutshell chronology of how Connecticut changed over the course of its first century or so, and then 2 or 3 implications of this change. And it did change enormously, particularly in the progressive era. I'm going to argue that from the 1890s, early 20th century, a huge restructuring in Connecticut industry took place. So here is my chronology, a nutshell chronology. Right from the beginning, when European settlers arrived in Connecticut, there was manufacturing in rural areas, grist mills, sawmills, blacksmith shops. There are, of course, remnants of this all over Connecticut. One of my favorite places, Gay City State Park, where there's remnants of a grist mill. So that's sort of the beginning of industry, but that's all related to rural, rural economy. Then we moved into the early national period after the Revolution of 1776, late 1700s. And at that point, Connecticut is not a strong farming state. So people had to make do with what they could, and they began manufacturing in their workshops and their homes, tinware, brass buttons, steel axes, and peddled them, from their carts. So that's where the term Yankee peddler comes from. That was part of the economy here in the early 19th century. But the stage that most interests me first is the one that occurred in the early 1800s. This was the establishment from some startup firms of the creation of more than 200 manufacturing villages. Sometimes they're called mill villages, and a few rural river towns where boats were manufactured. And a couple examples, very familiar examples of this in the early 19th century. These mill villages were typically in rural, where water power was. Another question was, what's the role of water power in Connecticut industrialization? Right on target, very important during the first half of the 19th century. The mill villages started where there was water power, which means they were in rural areas. So manufacturing started in Connecticut in rural areas. And they were scattered about the state in a very decentralized manner, all over the state. And this is important because these mill villages don't entirely go away. I mean, there's, as we see from the Collins Axe Factory in Collinsville, this is a typical mill village. They typically had factories, houses, boarding houses, shops, homes, churches, little, communities where there was revolving around a particular form of manufacturing. In Collinsville, of course, it was the axe mill founded by Samuel Collins in 1826. This was typical, and there are many of them: Scoville, Montville, Plainville, Thompsonville, Hitchcockville, Tariffville, Talcottville. Talcottville is right down the street from where I live. This was started as a mill area in the early 1800s and was taken over by the Talcott brothers in the 1850s, and they turned it into a mill village. And it was again, we get a church, boarding houses, homes for the factory owners, and there's still remnants of that today. And recently, DeMarco management converted this mill after a long heroic fight to make this work, converted this into apartments. And there's a picture of the apartment complex today. So again, these are very important, starts of the Connecticut industry, because a lot of these sites still exist. Many of them have been restored. And in part of Connecticut's industrial history is we have one stage of development, and then other stages of development are overlapped on them. So you can have within a few miles of each other, buildings and historic, edifices that come from different stages of industrialization. So think of Talcottville, on Route 83, modern Route 83, and then about 4 miles down the road is Rockville, which, is part of sort of the next stage of industrial development. And next stage of industrial development, I'm calling it the mature stage of industrial development. This is my term. The characteristics are scattered small and medium-sized manufacturers. And this is medium-sized compared to what's going to come later. So I would include the Ponema mill in Taftville. This was, I made cotton textiles. You look at that building and say, well, that's pretty big. They employ 1,200 people, and that's pretty big for the time, but that is, very small compared to what comes later. Think of American Brass Company that employed 16,000 people, during World War I, or, United States Steel, which employs tens of thousands when it was created in 1901. So that's one characteristic, but to think of these as small individual manufacturers. Another one, we can't see this one, is down here, is the, go back. The label is covered up, but this is the, it's now called American Thread, but then it was called the Willimantic Linen Company. This is mill number 2 I think it's on Main Street, or Ansonia Brass Company in Ansonia. So small companies like this, and what are going to become the big giants? I mean, like American Brass Company or International Silver in Meriden. They, in this stage of development, they exist as dozens of these small firms, Second characteristic of this stage is the formation of 3 big cities: Hartford, Bridgeport, New Haven, and importantly, 12 dispersed mid-sized industrial cities. And we're talking here about Meriden, Willimantic, Middletown, Waterbury, other towns. There's 12 of them around the state. Again, industry is very dispersed in Connecticut. A third characteristic, and very important, is internal railroad expansion. So this was a time when American railroads are expanding out west, creating a national marketplace where many Connecticut producers sent their products. Well, internal railroad expansion was taking place too, connecting places within the state. The beginning of the shift of the fourth characteristic from water power to fossil fuel coal burning energy. And this is just getting started during this time period, mainly in the western part of the state, although some mills in eastern Connecticut are starting to embrace steam power. At first, they used it for electrical lighting to run generators. Later, they converted to run their machinery. But this, in the long run, this is the direction which the economy is going to go. Because in an economic sense, if you think like a capitalist, you're going to make more money off of an industry that runs off of fossil fuels, because you can create more energy, you can run a bigger factory, you can create bigger batches of goods. And what's going to happen in the progressive era is there's going to be a big shift from the textile industry to the metalworking industries in the West. And that's what I'm getting at in point number 5, is you see a very pronounced east-west regional division in industry within Connecticut. Textiles in the east, metalworking in the west. Of course, I'm oversimplifying, but that's the big division that happens at this time. And so we come into my period and the progressive era. And my progressive era, I'm defining as 1890s to 1910s. And I see a huge change in industry taking place in the state, and a change I think that a lot of people are not aware of. And I'm calling this the corporate stage of industrial development. And this has a number of characteristics. This really, you see a big emphasis now on fossil fuel, coal burning, and then after 1900, electrical engines for manufacturing. So really a big change in energy takes place. And what that's going to do is it's going to shift the sort of the core of American industry, Connecticut industry, from the eastern part of the state to the western part of the state. Because again, that's where the money's being made. Textiles are still profitable. As late as 1910, textiles were still Connecticut's top industry, but textiles are rapidly being eclipsed by the fossil fuel supported metal and rubber industries in the western part of the state. This is not often observed. There's an infrastructure revolution going on at this time. And I'm talking not only about transportation, more railroad building, but also streetcars. Streetcars become very important in the 1880s and 1890s for both freight and residential traffic. I mean, up here in Rockville, Vernon, I mean, the streetcars, that was the transportation in the 1890s and early 1900s. And the way people related to places, was basically on the streetcar, and so that was important, and then eventually paved roads. Paved roads come in at the very beginning of the 20th century, but they're not, in my sense, very influential until the 1910s. Utilities. Utilities, there's about 2.5 dozen local utilities. We're talking about electric companies, starting with the Hartford Electric Light Company, Telco. But there's about 2.5 dozen of them around the state, which brings electrical power not only to the big cities, but to smaller industrial towns. Water utilities, gas utilities. There's a tremendous amount of building of these utilities. And for historic preservationists, I wonder if many of these buildings are still up. They could become historic sites. And finally, the banking industry. I mean, the banking industries there's a network, not only the big banks, the investment banks in Hartford and New Haven, but, local savings and loans banks in, Rockville, Middletown, that, that support the development of local industry, all very, very important. Third characteristic, and I'm arguing this is one of the big ones you see, the core of Connecticut history, shifting away from textiles toward the Western metal goods. We're talking about brass foundries. We're talking about machinery shops, lock factories, the hardware industry in New Britain. That's where you see a big shift takes place. And in a moment, I'm going to show you that this produces a big change, a shift in wealth. I mean, who's got the money in Connecticut, increasing as people in the western part of the state. And I think that's got to have huge political implications. And finally, and this is the most important thing, that there is consolidation of Connecticut industry away from the small firms that employ 500 or maybe 1,000, employees up to, over 10,000 employees. Really, really important. And this expansion took place in 2 ways. And just to give you a few examples of how this took place, and I think this is the key change that happens to progressive. One way that the industries got big is that the small single unit firms, single unit means that they're in one plant. They typically have 1 or 2 processing, manufacturing processes, like, in textiles, it would be spinning and weaving. That would be the main thing that they do. Or in brass, would be, smelting brass and then rolling rails. That would be a simple thing. So you get these single, unit firms. They do one operation, and they first expand and take on other aspects of the operation. So, for example, the Cheney brothers in Manchester is an excellent example. Starts out mainly spinning and weaving silk, and by the time we get to the end of the century, they have dyeing operations. They're making ribbon. They have all kinds of specialized operations in a very large 175-acre campus. It's a very large operation. And the interesting thing about the Cheney Company, it's a family-run operation right from the get-go. I mean, even when it was incorporated, it's the Cheney family. Hope you can see part of the picture on the right, these are members of the Cheney family. When you read the minutes of the Cheney Corporation, basically it's family, it's the brothers and, and sons that show up to the corporation meetings. And some women are there who are widows of some of the corporation members who have passed on. So the Cheney family ran the company through a series of committees and managerial posts. But even so, it's an expanded operation. Very similar was the Sargent Company of New Haven. This started out find my notes here. Started out when the Peck and Walter Company in New Britain went bankrupt, and their sales agent in New York's Joseph B. Sargent took it over and got together with two of his brothers, George and Edward, to try to save the business. And they did. They saved the business, reorganized it in 1859, and then moved it to New Haven in 1864. And ran it as a family enterprise until 1908. I mean, it's amazing. This company has 4 expansions between 1864, when they first moved to New Haven, and 1900. They expanded the firm 4 times and built new buildings, so that while they started out just making a few, items of shelf hardware and a few tools, by 1900, they're making deadbolts, door latches, padlocks, and most notably, coffin hardware. That was their big item. And I noticed reading their sales ledger that by the early 1900s, Sargent had an international business. They're doing an overseas business, being over $100,000, almost $200,000 worth of business overseas, mostly in Europe, but beginning in Latin America. So this is one example how firms got big. They see the small single unit firms expanded and became big operations. The more famous way is merger. And this takes place in the wake of the great merger movement in American business history that started around 1895 and lasted until around 1905. And this happened across Connecticut. There are numerous mergers in Connecticut, and I'm just going to list some of them. United States Rubber, International Silver, United States Envelope Company, the American Thread Company, American Brass Company, American Hardware Company, the Honk and Mill Company, and even in agriculture, American Sumatra. That was an integrated firm that provided for the growing of tobacco. And so why did these big mergers come about? Well, there are 2 examples which would illustrate this. Again, this is the Willimantic plant of American Thread. And notice I don't call it American Thread, I call it the Willimantic plant. This is how it came about. The United States had a high protective tariff on cotton textiles, and British textile manufacturers wanted to break into the American thread market, and they couldn't do it because of the tariff. So what they did is some English thread manufacturers out of Eastern England, Yorkshire, formed the English Sewing Cotton Company, whose purpose was simply to set up a company in the United States where they could basically, exert some influence and make some profits off the American thread market. And so I'm not making this up. They hired a lawyer in New York whose name was John Dos Passos Sr. And that's funny because he's the father of John Dos Passos Jr., who was a left-wing novelist. But John Dos Passos Sr., he's the architect of many big monopolies, including the American Sugar Refining Company. And they hire him to create this big holding company of thread manufacturers in New England. And Willimantic Linen was one of them. So Willimantic Linen became one of about a dozen thread manufacturers in New England that became part of this big holding company called American Thread Company that the English, textile manufacturers are trying to use to nose their way into the American thread market. And the Willimantic Linen Company owners sold out largely because Willimantic Linen actually was in big trouble, financial trouble, because of the depression of the 1890s. And so the owners of the company said, let's sell out while we can sell out. So they sold out, the English take over, and then another company, it's called J&P Coats in Scotland, a notorious monopoly, bought a majority share of the English Sewing Cotton Company. So by the early 20th century, American Thread was in fact being run by this company in Scotland as part of this international firm. And you may think that, thread, this is a business for gentle homemakers. This might be a really nice business. Well, it's not. I mean, it's the American Thread Company, out of their sales office in New York, used some really predatory tactics. And one of them, just to give you one example, is that when they created this holding company, they retired some of the former brands like Kerr Thread Company and Fall River. They retired that brand. But then when independent brands began catching up around 1905, American Thread brought back the old brands like Kerr Thread and basically sold their thread underpriced on the market to put the independent competitors out of business. This is illegal. They did this. They also had flying squads of salesmen that would go to wholesalers and basically use pressure tactics to get them to buy American Thread. Eventually, American Thread was broken up in an antitrust suit, U.S. versus American Thread Company in 1914. And then it became simply an American company. So this was an American, this is one American, Connecticut company. And I think a lot of people don't know about its more disreputable history. Another example is the American Brass Company. And this started out in the 1880s with a dozen brass foundries along the Naugatuck River Valley, who competed with each other. They tried to form a pool in the 1880s. A pool is a voluntary organization where companies voluntarily promise to, charge set prices and, only respect certain markets. Pools never work because there's always somebody that breaks it. And it didn't matter because the Sherman Antitrust Act made pooling illegal in 1890. So in the early 1890s, some of these companies from the Naugatuck Valley got together and they formed the American Brass Company. The brains behind this was Charles F. Brooker. That's the gentleman shown on the screen. He was the president of the Co. Manufacturing Company in Torrington, or is it Ansonia? The things in Torrington. Basically, the idea was to bring these companies together, and they formed a holding company. This is the way a lot of these mergers started out. A holding company, which meant that Waterbury Brass and Ansonia Brass and Co. Manufacturing Company, they theoretically could still operate independently, but any sales they made and any prices they charged had to be cleared by the sales office of the American Brass Company. So there you see there's that effort to control competition. And so they finally, Charles Brooker finally consolidated the firm around 1910 and basically ended the independence of these local companies. But this was a very, very important company. And one of our other questions that came up, which I can't fully answer, but I can give some information here. The question was, which industries had the largest leverage on the state assembly? I don't know the answer. I think this changed over time. The insurance industry was enormously powerful, but I point to American Brass Company because Charles Brooker, a local man who was born in Connecticut, he was a state representative, a state senator in the state legislature, and a leading member of the Republican Party. So clearly, American Brass Company had some leverage, in the state legislature. So those are some of the examples of how the industry consolidated. And now I want to just spend a few minutes with you talking about some of the implications of these changes in state industry. And one is, it came out of my thinking as I'm working on this chapter, I'm trying to say to myself, think like a businessman, think like a capitalist. How are you going to make money? Where is the money going? Follow the money, right? So I looked at tax records, tax records from the state tax commissioner. And what I found is this from this chart, just a few statistics to share with you. Look at where most of the property wealth in Connecticut shifts between 1880 and 1950. I mean, so already in 1880, 2/3 of property wealth in Connecticut's in the three industrial counties, Fairfield, New Haven, and southern part of Hartford County. But by the time we get to 1915, 81%, 4/5 of the wealth of the state is in those three counties, and wealth is proportionally drifting away from those other counties. I mean, so if you look at, the Collin County, pretty rural county, 2% of state wealth. I mean, compared to Fairfield County, Collin County is poor. Wyndham County, 3%. Is pretty poor, So you see this huge wealth drift. So where the money is being made is really in the western part of the state, even though the textile industry is still going strong in the 1910s. It's going to go strong in the 1910s. It's going to boom during World War I. And then you know what happens. It bottoms out in the 20s. And then it bottoms out in the 1920s. And then textile mills and textile machinery begin going southward. So, but in this point, even then, we see this huge shift in wealth that takes place. And so I'm thinking, again, getting back to that question about which industries had the biggest leverage, I'm thinking at this point, it's got to be those Western, brass industry, the rubber industry. The textile industry has less influence than it had before. So Rockville, just one anecdote, Rockville, little tiny Rockville, 8,000 people, 8,000 people in 1910. Rockville was the sort of the headquarters of the Democratic Party in 1910. I mean, that might tell you something. The state Democratic chairman was from Rockville, the former mayor of Rockville. So that might tell you something about where influence lies. I mean, Rockville is really a pretty small industrial city. But really it's sort of the heart of the Democratic Party at that point, at the Democratic Party leadership at that point. So you might think, here's another implication, that the shift of wealth to the industrial counties is largely a product of shift of economic activity from rural areas to urban areas. And this is the way that almost all Connecticut historians see it. They argue that in general, the Yankee small town basically give up population, they give up wealth, and it all migrates to the big cities. Now, I'm sort of exaggerating, but that's the general theory. And there's admittedly some truth to this, because some rural areas, particularly up here in Litchfield was a grain growing part of the state. They raised cattle. This was part of agriculture that took the big hit in the 1890s. And this is a part of agriculture that definitely did decline. But I found out that not all rural towns, about 100 rural towns, not all rural towns declined. And one of the reasons is a lot of rural towns, as I try to indicate with this map, have significant manufacturing activity still going on in them. And I try to illustrate that. Look at Middlesex County. Middlesex County at that point was the most rural county in Connecticut by population. But look at on the left-hand side of the screen, this is a list in the Connecticut Department of Labor report, 1914, the list of all the factories in Middlesex County. There's a lot of factories in Middlesex County for a rural county, and all these little towns have manufacturers in them. And here are some examples. M.S. Brooks. M.S. Brooks is in a town that's in Chester, town of Chester, a rural town. It's under 2,500 people. That's how the census defined rural. But yet it's a little factory in Chester, but yet it's very significant. What M.S. Brooks did, founded in the middle of the 19th century, it remanufactured steel. And what people would do is they would send in, you see this, made to order book, they would send in this diagram, please make me a hook, look that looks like this. And then they would take steel that comes from some other factories in Connecticut or elsewhere in the United States, and they would remanufacture that steel into the items that their customers wanted. They're selling to some very, very significant firms. I mean, Western Electric, Sears Roebuck, Russells and Irwin in New Britain, Hammacher Schlemmacher. If they're selling to Hammacher Schlemmacher, you know they got a big market. And this is in a rural town. And the point is, you look across the rural towns in Middlesex, I mean, they have a lot of factories. Chatham, today we call it East Hampton, population 2,400, has 11 factories. Clinton, population 1,300, 4 factories. East Haddam, population 2,400, 7 factories. Saybrook, today we call it Deep River, 1,900 population, 4 factories. So one of the big reasons, you know, you get is there's a lot of manufacturing still going on in rural areas, and manufacturing never totally left rural Connecticut. I mean, as I said before, those early rural beginnings of Connecticut manufacturing, a lot of that hangs on, and then it's, you know, it's layered on top with new industries that get built there and get built elsewhere. Another reason why the rural towns don't all decline is, and so just to look at this map first, what I try to do here, I'll get to that in a minute. Let's do this one first. One of the reasons why rural towns don't all decline is if they don't go to the city comes to them. And a good example of this is the town of Litchfield. Now, town of Litchfield is technically an urban town, quote unquote, because it had 3,005 people. But that is very misleading, because if you look at Litchfield, I don't know if you can see my cursor, Litchfield is a very big county geographically. They're geographically very big, and that's why it makes it up to 3,000. And most of the people, the 3,000 people live in Litchfield, there's no factories, there's no manufacturing at all in Litchfield. Most of the people who live there are residents. Most of the property there is residential. And you can see how Litchfield operates by looking at the day book, the account book of W.G. Granis Company. I couldn't find a picture. I don't know if a building still exists. It would be a wonderful historic site. This was a country store. This is their day book, and basically what happened would customers would come in and they would buy some items. They would get some eggs, maybe some ribbon from Cheney Brothers that they had bought from Cheney Brothers. And then the W.G. Granis would write their purchases in the book. And you notice there's a number on the left. Each customer has a number. And then at the end of the month, they would settle their accounts. So I looked at, you know, where is W.G. Granis buying their products from? Are they buying locally? Well, they're buying some locally. Farmer M.D. Beach, they bought a lot of butter from him. Guess he was a dairy farmer. But they bought groceries from the from the Maplewood farm in New Milford, which is nearby. But they bought a lot of stuff. Most of their stuff they bought from out of town, even New York. They're buying our groceries from wholesalers in New York. I can hardly believe this. You know, National Biscuit Company, we call it Nabisco today. I mean, they ship crates. I mean, crates and crates of stuff up to the Granis Company in Litchfield. So Litchfield, in many ways, had a lot of trappings of urban society by the fact that they're located on the railroad line. Okay, couple more implications. I'm watching my time, Jane. So, did farming decline? This is one of my passions right now is to argue against a wholesale view that farming collapsed in Connecticut during the Progressive Era. Some of it did, up in Litchfield County. And if you look at my chart again, the acres of improved land, these are acres under cultivation, there's no doubt it went down. So if you look at the number of acres cultivated, sure looks like farming is taking a dive. But that is misleading. because what happens is the Connecticut farming reorganizes during the late 19th century and the early 20th century and embraces what agriculture experts call intensive farming. And what we're talking about are small, efficient farms that produce specialized items, particularly if they're near urban areas, that they can service urban areas. So if you look at the total value of farm property, I mean, they take a big dive in the 1880s. Again, that's when the Connecticut cattle industry, you know, the slaughtering industry takes a dive. But after that, Connecticut agriculture revives and pretty profitable by the 1910s. Value of family farm is going up a lot by 1910. So what are some of these farms like? So shade tobacco. Obviously, shade tobacco becomes a big industry in Connecticut in the 1880s and 1890s, early 20th century, along the flat, shallow areas along the Connecticut River, straddling Hartford and north of Hartford. I go bicycling along the river in this area, and there's many tobacco fields, even today. There's still many fields in the tobacco. And the tobacco became one of the big success story in Connecticut agriculture during the late Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. But not only tobacco. Preservation Connecticut recently featured Dudley Farm in North Guilford. And this is an excellent example of a farm that converted to the new realities. And one of the features of this historic site is to indicate that in the middle of the 19th century, a Dudley Farm converted to dairy farming, milk raising. And that became sort of the staple of the finances of that particular farm. And that was very, very typical of many of Connecticut farmers who, you know, embrace milk, which they sent not only to New Haven and Bridgeport, but sometimes they sent it up to Boston and New York. Another example, this comes from an exhibit, a wonderful exhibit, which you can find online. It's put together by the students of Professor, forget her first name, Ruth Glasser at UConn Waterbury. They did an exhibit on farmers near Waterbury. And what the students found is that farming was thriving. In truck farms, vegetable farms, like Maple Hill Farm near Waterbury, they're thriving because they could feed to the city. So the point is that, you know, both with rural manufacturing and some farms who could convert, especially near the urban areas, that side of Connecticut agriculture actually did pretty well during the Progressive Era. Not unfortunately, you know, not fortunately like the farmers who did suffer in the eastern part of Connecticut. So, so just a couple quick points. One other quick point is one sort of big successful story, if you call it agriculture, is A.N. Pearson's greenhouse in Cromwell. Cromwell, again, is another rural town. Pearson was a Swedish immigrant. He took over a failed business in the 1860s, 70s, moved in with his wife. He married a widow in Cromwell, and they turned that business around and turned it into a very, very successful rose business. And so A.N. Pearson became the rose king of the United States, basically producing cut roses to send to the, you know, to New Haven, you know, Hartford, Boston, New York, even down to Philadelphia. And that's one example of successful agriculture in Connecticut. Now, my last point, my last implication, and that is that I'm very interested in the impact of industrial change on the ethnic makeup of Connecticut. Because we know that hundreds of thousands of Eastern European immigrants are flooding into Connecticut. We know that some hundreds, not many, but some hundreds of African Americans are leaving the South and coming up to Connecticut. We know that there are women in Connecticut who are of, you know, have business, you know, acumen. There is a native population in Connecticut, even though the culture of the time was all the time talking about the disappearing Native American or the last of the Mohicans. And that is a misleading characterization of Native people in Connecticut at the time. So I'm interested what role did any of these groups, other than white, Anglo men who have the skills, who have the financial backing, who have the connections to start industry, are there examples of business for them? And there aren't many, but there are some, which I think historic preservation should pay attention to. One industrialist for immigrants is the Strauss-Adler Company, created by Bavarian Jewish manufacturers Isaac Strauss and Max Adler in the 1860s, and created a very successful corset business in New Haven. It's one of the few exceptions I found to the sort of the exclusion of immigrants from Eastern European immigrants from manufacturing. Most immigrants are associated with small businesses like grocery stores and tailor shops, businesses that don't need a lot of financing that you can screed in the cities. But Strauss-Adler is sort of an example of how immigrants could get businesses going. What about African Americans? I mean, African Americans, there's very few African Americans in Connecticut, about 1,200 in 1900, 1,500 in 1910. They face, of course, a discriminatory environment. They don't have money, they don't have skills or networkings. But I found a few businessmen who did make a go of it. A couple of examples of this: A.F. Crawford in Meriden. I mean, he was a landscaper. I mean, he's really scraping by as a landscaper, spotted a hotel that was being torn down in Meriden, and they were about to throw away the big windows in the hotel. So he salvaged those windows and turned them into a greenhouse and created a very successful florist business in Meriden. And this is the city directory from Meriden in 1896. I don't know if this building looked like, this looks like quite a florist business if he succeeded. So it's African-American A.F. Crawford. Or an even better example is Mr. Keffer, James Keffer in Waterbury. Migrated from Virginia, started in Waterbury as a waiter, then became a caterer, and he ran a small laundry. Then he went into the real estate business, and the white realtors scoffed at him, said, "You guys, African-American can't do this business," but he was really good at it. And he especially found a niche in the rental market. And he made a lot of money, and eventually he founded the Waterbury National Business League and built an apartment complex. This is a building he put up where African Americans who had trouble finding housing could get housing in Waterbury. So I don't know if that building is still standing there, but I would think that would be a historic landmark. So last point, what about Native people? They're hard to count. The census says there are 152 Native people in Connecticut in 1910. I think that's a huge undercount. They're hard to count because they're very intermarried with African Americans and white Connecticut residents. Almost all of them live in cities. There are 5 reservations that I try to indicate on the map: Eastern Pequot, Western Pequots, Mashantuckets, a non-reservation Mohegan community, Schaghticoats, and then the Paugussets are scattered all around. They virtually don't have a reservation at that point. Most of them live in cities. Their culture does not lend itself to accumulating, saving capital to build factories. And so consequently, the Native people are basically poor, especially if they stay on the reservation. So at this point, the Native population is largely excluded, from the manufacturing consolidation, except if they move into cities, as industrial workers. So that's a lot of material there, and I hope I've given you a sense that there's a lot going on, just in terms of industry for in Connecticut during this time period. And if I've raised any questions or not answered, any questions properly, please let me know now. So I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent presentation. I'll open it up to the floor if anybody wanted to ask a question.
I have a question. The gun manufacturing industry was very big, and that you didn't mention that, and especially with Samuel Colt and the invention
Right.
of the revolver. Do you have any comments on that?
Right. Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. The Colt manufacturing began, as I would regard, as one is born during the sort of mature stage of industrial production. The plant was built in the early 1860s, and Samuel Colt died, and then his widow and other operatives took over the country. So you're right that the firearms industry is very important, and you're right. I should have mentioned it, and you can probably find other industries I didn't mention as well. There's a lot to fit into a 45-minute talk, but you're absolutely right. But I would fix it in the mature stage of production, not an industry that expanded in a much larger industry later on.
Yeah, my follow-up question is, he's often seen as the person that started the assembly. He's credited with the idea of an assembly line. Am I mistaken, or is that correct?
No, I agree with that. He does introduce the assembly line. And again, he sort of illustrates, I mean, Hartford is in the middle of the state, but he illustrates that beginning of that shift toward metalworking. And so he used, techniques, used earlier in the firearms industry to create an assembly line process within the, within the Colt plant in Hartford. And later on, that's imitated by, I didn't mention the bicycle industry. I apologize to those who were bicyclists myself. The bicycling industry was very significant in Hartford in the 1890s and early 1900s. And a lot of that technology and the assembly line process was carried over, into the bicycling industry. So you're absolutely right. So if I may, just one follow-up on Mr. Rainwright's questions is that I think he's illustrated, finding some gaps in my presentation. This is a very complicated subject, and there are a lot of nooks and crannies that you can overlook in a short talk. And I hope that is encouragement for other people to start working on this too, or continue to work on this too. So Connecticut industrial history is very important, and I've only scraped the surface of it.
Dr. Rogers,
Yes.
thank you very much. A very, very interesting presentation. I've heard that the original owner, in fact, the builder of GE's giant factory campus in Bridgeport was Tsar Nicholas of Russia. Do you know anything about that?
I do not know that, sir, but thank you for mentioning that because I will check it out.
There's a church, a Russian Orthodox church near what was that factory. And that church has two bells, which were given to the church by Tsar Nicholas and Alexandra.
Mm-hmm. So that's a great lead, and I will.
Yeah, I have some information on that. I've heard the same thing. I heard he built it in the United States because he was afraid that if he built it in Russia, it was going to be taken over by the Bolsheviks.
I heard that
this
he
was
wanted an offshore source of armaments.
exactly.
Yeah.
So when was it built?
My father actually worked in that building. Well, GE was his customer in the 70s and 80s. Probably I remember going with him when I was in college and visiting him, and they were explaining to me how there were 7 built structures, and each one could have blown up on itself, and the other 6 would have survived. So it's quite a bit of thought brought into that. Anyway,
Extraordinary story.
So
Thank you very much. Again, it was a very, very enjoyable presentation.
So thank you. You give me a good lead. The GE plant was built during World War I. What was the timing on that?
I gather it was built in the late 19th century, maybe very early 20th.
Okay, I will check this out. Thank you.
it had to be prior to 1917, right? Or
Oh, yeah.
right.
I heard another part of the story that factory built armaments for both sides in World War One.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you. Great points, Jim and Mr. Rainwright.
Karen had a question in the chat. Did you come across information about munitions factories and how women worked in them when the men went overseas during World War I?
So that's a great question, and I didn't take my story past 1910. So your point about women in munitions factories is absolutely right during World War I, but I didn't take my story that far down the line. So let me offer two other observations on top of that. First off, you may disagree with me for stopping my story in the 1910s. My reasoning in that is that World War I had such a distinct impact that it has to be considered on its own. And what I'm trying to do is to catch the parameters of industrial development before World War I came along. And you may say my reasoning isn't good there. The second point is that absolutely right about women in the munitions industry, but we might raise the question about women in other industries in Connecticut. And I didn't get to that, but there's clearly a large female workforce, certainly in the textile industry and in even metalworking industry in Connecticut. Brass Valley, I don't know if you know that book, a really excellent book of interviews on the brass industry, covers a lot of sort of the gender dimensions of the brass industry. So, but sort of the gender issue of who works in these factories, even if women did not own them, is a very important question. And I hope to get to that in a later talk.
Yes, and Renee Trubert put in the chat a link to Preservation Connecticut's connecticutmills.org industrial survey that we have online. And you can find a link. She put a link directly to the Remington Arms company in Bridgeport that we were just chatting about.
Right. So I must say that the mill site has been very useful to me. And it, as you know, is a historical research to get sort of the beginnings of the history of some of these mills. And that's just a starting point. I mean, I'd like to know more. I mean, the question about water power is an excellent one. I mean, that's where Connecticut industry started in rural areas with water power and then shifts away from that. That's an important chapter. Most important changes in Connecticut history, the shift from water-powered industries to the coal, fossil fuel-powered industries.
So are you anticipating a book to come from this?
Right, maybe this is wishful thinking. I retired. So so my ambition is to get this done before I get too old to do it. So yes, I would like to turn it into a book because the progressive era is wildly understudied.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's it's much neglected period of Connecticut history. And I think me and other people need to take a closer look at what's going on. And not only in terms of industry, but the growth of cities, the experience of immigrants, African Americans, I mean, a very distinct experience, Native people, that's badly neglected. So there's a lot to do, we can all do by looking at the progressive era. So I'm going to take my first shot.
Well, terrific. Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. And we certainly want to keep in touch as you develop more of your research.
Okay, well, thank you, Jane, and thank you to the audience. And thank you, Renee.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Terrific, Donald. Thanks
Okay,
so
thank
much.
you.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.